Okay, this is part 2 of chapter 3. It'll finish up chapter 3. On the topics of the next section are the digestive tract. So we're going to look at the actual parts of the tract, how we store nutrients. This goes a little bit into the immune system, just slightly. Um, Problems that can occur if a digestive system isn't working correctly, and just touching on genetics. So mostly it's about digestion, the actual details. So we're going to look at the idea that we take large molecules, so you don't swallow. There's a funny nursery rhyme about the horse. Remember the lady who swallowed a horse and she died, of course. So it's kind of a funny story, but of course we can't eat large molecules. We have to break them down. So there's two methods, a mechanical and chemical. Even in your mouth, both of the mechanical and chemical breakdowns occur because of this saliva. Saliva is a chemical breakdown of not just carbohydrates, but also fats. It starts the process of digestion. And then, of course, because of your mastication of chewing, you get a mechanical breakdown. And then as they move through the system, they break down to smaller portions until they're just tiny fatty acids or monosaccharides or amino acids, so they can be absorbed into the GI tract and move from there either to the blood or the lymph. So that's the whole process we're talking about, and the way it occurs is, of course, the GI tract is a straight line. It's I think 22 feet long or something, but the mouth is part of the tract. The esophagus is just a movement down to the stomach. It's just a passageway. There's really no digestion that goes on, but it's part of the tract. The stomach, there's not much absorption that occurs. Most of the absorption is in the small intestine, but the stomach does have a huge part in the chemical breakdown and somewhat of mechanical, especially proteins and fat. Small intestine, because of the pancreas sending in all sorts of digestive enzymes at this point, there's a lot of digestion and absorption that goes on. The large intestine is mostly where the water and a few vitamins and minerals are absorbed. And then the rectum is storing storing the waste to be moved out through the anus. So that's of course important, because if that doesn't happen, you get backup. It can cause pneumonia and death. So you have to move things through your system. The excess of the digestive system then is a chemical and mechanical, as we mentioned. The peristalsis is how things move through the system, not just the esophagus, but all the way through. This muscle contraction is occurring. And also there's mucus along the way. There's a lot of mucus forming cells that allow this movement to happen. Otherwise things would get stuck and wouldn't. I really encourage you to look at this animation when it comes time. There's a little link and it shows you all the details of the different enzymes that enter at different points. It's a great review and introduction to the digestive system that we're going to talk about. So take a look at that. And then this here just shows the fact that, of course, in your mouth, you're going to start already breaking things down mechanically, so that there's a huge increase in surface area. As you break things to smaller pieces, it's much easier for the enzymes to attack and break things down to even smaller portions. So then we have this formation in the upper GI of a bolus first, while you're forming a bolus in your mouth as your saliva mixes with the food. So that's a kind of you know what it feels like when you're swallowing food. It's not small particles. It's kind of a ball of mucus, saliva, and the food that's partially chewed. That moves down the esophagus and then by peristalsis. And then when it hits the stomach, it's mixing with gastric juices. So now we don't call it a bolus anymore. We call it chyme or chyme. And that is a mixture of kind of fluid. And you know what that is too if you've ever had a stomach flu and lost what's in your stomach. It's very acidic, very liquidy as things are trying to digest. And as it continues to move through, this is back to the esophagus, and you have to look at this. It's really interesting. It shows the peristalsis if you click on that link when you get to that video. And then the other thing to understand is a sphincter. So there's a little muscle, kind of like a drawstring in your backpack. These muscles close up, open, close. Otherwise, you would have food just dumping. It's called the dumping syndrome. So people that don't have good control, or these sphincters aren't working properly, the food doesn't digest as well. The sphincters give the food time to stay in each of the areas where they need to stay, for digestion. So there's a sphincter before the stomach and there's another one after the stomach. Otherwise, things would move too quickly through the system. Some people have heartburn. You can see here's a picture where if the stomach acid backs up into the esophagus, it's very painful because the acid's much lower in the stomach than it is the esophagus. So that's something that has to be dealt with. It's called GERD. We'll talk about that too in this chapter. Another aspect here is the other sphincter here. It's called the pyloric sphincter at the end of the stomach. So this is still the stomach moving things mechanically and chemically. So you can see the peristalsis is still occurring even in the stomach, and that moves it into the duodenum, which is where a lot of the absorption will occur. So that's the movement through the system. You'll see more slides about that. One thing that's interesting too, though, is there's also hormones. So when you just smell food, you start thinking, I might be hungry, but also the smelling of food triggers gastrin, which is a hormone, and that already gets your stomach prepared. So your pH of your stomach is not that low if you're not eating. But once you start thinking about food or eating food, gastrin will allow your stomach to stimulate the produce of this in the parietal cell. It triggers this formation of hydrochloric acid and pepsin. This is an acid and this is an enzyme that are produced in the cells of your stomach, right along the lining of your stomach, which increase the acid so that the breakdown of the food can occur. And then as you stop eating, there's a negative feedback where these G cells will inhibit the production of gastrin. So you won't have any gastrin for a while, so the pH doesn't stay low. So there's a change in pH over the time of digestion. It doesn't always. So there's hormones going on, and there's enzymes going on during digestion. There's mucus to help things move. There's muscle action. There's a lot happening to have a good digestive system. Here's a picture of the anatomy of the small intestine. There's a lot of detail in here. But one thing you want to note is that the lining of the intestine isn't just smooth. There's a lot of, the same thing in the stomach. The stomach lining is not smooth. You'll see that in some slides. But these, if you look even closer, you'll see that along the lining of the stomach are these little villi, almost like finger projections. So of course you can tell that increases the absorption area, surface area, tremendously by many, many times. So without this villi, you can't absorb things as well. And inside each villi is actually not just a blood vessel or capillary, but also part of your lymph system, which is called a lacteal. When they're very sort of like a tiny blood vessel is called a capillary, a tiny lymph node or lymph vessel is called a lacteal. And so that can collect the fats, the proteins, the vitamins, minerals, and all the things as it finally is digested and ready for absorption, which is why the small intestine is the best place for absorption to occur. So that'll become important as we go down the line. And this just shows that the large intestine, that it does not have the villi, and there's really no enzymes that are produced or sent there. But there's a lot of absorption of extra water. That's why if you have too little water absorption, you might be constipated, or too much water absorption, you might have diarrhea. So that's all very important to balance. And then the wastes, of course, move through here. There's the mucus again. A lot of bacteria, which is the probiotics, which we also depend on, and we'll talk about that later, but that's a very important aspect of the large intestine. And then moving on to the accessory organs. So there's some organs that the food does not actually go through, but they're very essential. So the gallbladder produces or stores the bile. The liver produces the bile. The gallbladder stores the bile, and that's important for a breakdown of fat. So these are called accessory organs because they're necessary, but they're not they're not part of the lumen where the food goes through. And we mentioned already the enterohepatic circulation, which you can see that after you've eaten something, it's absorbed in the small intestine from the stomach, and it moves right directly to the hepatic portal vein to the liver for storage and processing. So the liver is the largest organ in your body, and it's of course, where all these things are produced. It's very, very important for absorption, storage, and production of bile. The other accessory organ is the pancreas, which we mentioned in the first video, and this is the one that produces a lot of the pancreatic juices and enzymes necessary and the hormones to help the blood sugar control. So those are essential parts to the digestive system. There's some more discussion about all the different enzymes that are produced in this chapter, where they work, what they do. And then the last section just talks about problems of digestion. What happens if things don't work correctly? You've all heard of ulcers. So when you have an injury to the lining of your stomach, it's very painful. You don't have the protection of the mucus, and you have this pain. It's very painful. So a lot of this can be caused by a particular bacteria. So sometimes you can take antibiotics and it will work the treatment. So while you have an ulcer, you have to be very careful what you eat because it can stimulate pain. Another thing would be heartburn or GERD we talked about just now. So the up of the acid into the esophagus is painful. So you can take medication for that, or some people just lose weight helps. Sometimes you can sit up after you eat. Don't eat large meals before bed, and so forth. Those are ways of kind of dealing with that. Hemorrhoids is another issue. They used to call it piles. That's very painful also. So it's in your anus area where you have blood vessels that are expanding and actually blocking and bleeding and so forth. And so when you're straining with bowel movement, sometimes after you've had a baby or the pregnancy, these things can flare up. And there's the treatment for that. Irritable bowel syndrome is very difficult to assess the cause of. Sometimes it's just very serious food allergies, but that causes extreme gassiness, bloating, cramps, and sometimes you'll have flare-ups and other times it can be under control, but you have to often figure out what is it, and sometimes people can't, that's causing these extremely painful bouts. And we talked about diarrhea. Again, here, if you have infections that can cause diarrhea, sometimes just eating a lot of fiber, excess fiber. These artificial sweeteners like sorbitol for some people can cause diarrhea because it doesn't digest as well. And so when it comes all the way through your digestive system and lands in your large intestine, it causes bloating and diarrhea. So another thing is celiac. The last thing we'll talk about is celiac, and that's an autoimmune disease. Again, it's not too many people have it. It's just 1% of the population, but it causes the breakdown of the villi. So without villi, as we know from what we just talked about, you have very little space for absorption. So most people with celiac disease have malabsorption and many nutrient deficiencies as a result. So you'll have a little review check of this chapter, some reviews, and hopefully you will be able to get through this and enjoy that information as well. So thank you very much.